Thanks, Vic. One of the most powerful stories in the Bible, and one of my favourites, is the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph began life as a spoilt brat in Palestine and ended up as the Prime Minister of Egypt. And the way he got there was via the treachery of his brothers, who hated him and sold him as a slave into Egypt, all the while telling his doting father that he had tragically been killed by a wild animal. One of the final scenes in this story is Joseph as Prime Minister of Egypt and his brothers bowing before him. They don't know it's him, of course, and they are begging for food. And Joseph, as the Prime Minister of Egypt, has all the security forces of a nation at his disposal. He just has to press the button, and sweet, sweet revenge happens. And they are dealt with and gone forever. What will he do? It's a very telling moment, a very tense moment, which we'll come back to at the end. So you better keep listening. Last week we were thinking about the shape of love. What does love look like? Words like genuine, fervent, hospitable, patient, prayerful, generous. All those kinds of words came out of that short passage just before this one. This week Paul gets more specific. What does love look like when we're dealing with people who oppose us or persecute us or hate us? Living in harmony with others. The big question in this passage is, what do we bleed when someone stabs us? Whether it's in the front or in the back, what do we bleed? Do we bleed bile spewing out over them? Or do we bleed grace and kindness? That's the question that's being asked here. Living in harmony with others, Romans 12:14 to 21. Paul's unpacking what it looks like to live a life that is responding to God's mercy towards us. A life of giving ourselves up as a living sacrifice to God. A life that's not shaped by the pressures of the world around us, but a life that's being transformed by the renewing of our minds in Christ. A life where we discover his good and pleasing and perfect will. That's what he said at the beginning of this chapter. And this part today is about how we live in harmony with others, particularly those who oppose and persecute us, but also those brothers and sisters who are hard work. So we're going to deal with it in two sections. Firstly, living with those who oppose. What happens when somebody opposes you? This is a real test of our faith, isn't it? At a simple level, when the person cuts in front of you in the traffic, what do? When somebody pushes in front of you at the checkout, how do you respond? When somebody at work calls you a bigot because of your beliefs, how do you respond? When the colleague at work is trying to get advantage over you and carrying out all sorts of skullduggery behind the scenes, how do you respond to that? When they stab you, what do you bleed? That's the question we're looking at today. For the people that Paul's writing to, this is a real question. In fact, it's going to be a very real question. Within 7 years of Paul writing this to them about how to deal with opposition, a persecution breaks out in Rome under the Emperor Nero that is swift and short and deadly. Tacitus, the Roman historian, records this. He says, an immense multitude was convicted of Christians. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt. to serve as a nightly illumination. And Nero, the emperor, offered his gardens for this spectacle. Friends, that's what these people that Paul's writing to were going to be facing. So what he says here is really, really pertinent. And it's to these people in verse 14 that Paul says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and don't curse. What does it mean to bless? Actually, the word behind this is the word that we use for eulogy at a funeral. Now, I've attended quite a few funerals and run quite a few myself, and I'm yet to hear somebody stand up at a funeral and say, well, Joe was a real ratbag and I'm so glad that he's dead. Nobody says stuff like that, even if he's been a criminal. I say, oh, well, he's a good dad, or, he was nice to his wife on the 23rd of December, 1942, whatever. We search for something good to say about them. And this is the word that Paul chooses to use for those who oppose us. Seek to speak well of them. Speak to do well towards them. Don't repay evil for evil, bad for bad, he says in verse 17. Now, you've got to confess, that's our default, isn't it? Someone trashes us on Facebook. Well, let's go for it. It's open slather. Well, she told lies about me behind my back, so I'm going to put a few things around about her. Home truths, which frequently aren't true, but not very homely either. We face these things all the time, don't we? Our natural tendency is to want to give as good as we get. But Paul says, never, never avenge yourselves, in verse 19. Why not? Well, he gives two good reasons. Firstly, he says we need to do what's honourable in the sight of all. What is good for others? For those who need to hear and see a living demonstration of the gospel. Those people like the rough Roman centurion who was in charge of putting Jesus to death. And when he saw how Jesus responded to the people who are mocking him and the people who are torturing him, people are yelling out, get rid of him. When he saw Jesus in that situation, the way he responded, what did he say? He said, surely this man's the Son of God. He can't be human if he's responding like that. He must be the Son of God. Do what is honourable in the sight of all. McCrindle research in polling non-Christians about what might influence them to consider Christ found that the top factor, which is hopefully coming up on the next slide, the top factor was seeing someone living out a genuine faith. Go back a couple of slides, Jimmy. I think that's the one. Yep. So 16% of non-Christians said the thing that would influence them to consider Christ was seeing someone living an authentic life. So, friends, people are watching when someone does the wrong thing to us, someone stabs us, and if they see us responding counter to our own desires and in a godly way, that impacts them. The second reason Paul gives here, he says that the reason why we must not avenge ourselves is because it's not our right anyway. It's God's right to take revenge. 3,000 years ago, Paul quotes, the verse that Paul quotes is given from Deuteronomy, way back in the beginning of the nation Israel. Vengeance is mine, the Lord says, I'll repay. That's my job, it's not yours. That's reiterated in the New Testament over and over again. We can trust God to handle this and handle it well and handle it much better than we can. Because we're always tempted, aren't we, to just go back that little bit harder so they don't do it again. But no, God's judgment, God's punishment is going to be absolutely fair and absolutely right. Nothing is hidden from God. There's nothing that he doesn't know. That's very different to us, isn't it? When people oppose us and do the wrong thing against us, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. What's going on in their life, for example. So Paul says there's no need for us to take revenge. Us Christians, we are we believe in a sovereign God who is the judge. He will sort everything out in the end. And we can leave him to do his job. At a practical level, Mahatma Gandhi has said, an eye for an eye. If we're going to take revenge, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. So instead of repaying evil for evil, in verse 20, Paul says, do good to your enemies. So if they're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them a drink. Understand their need, is what he's saying there, and seek to fulfill it. Understand what they need and seek to help them and fulfill their need. An engineer friend of mine was once abused by a colleague who accused him of wrecking his project. This guy was in charge of a project. Everyone in the office had projects. And he publicly accused my friend Stuart of ruining his project. And Stuart said, I'm really sorry that's happened. What can I do to help you to fix it? And everyone who witnessed it, everyone in the office, including the guy himself, knew that Stuart had nothing to do with it. And Stuart then set about helping him to get his project back on track. And Stuart's assistant took him aside and said, you're an idiot. You know, he knows, everybody knows that you've got nothing to do with it. You should have slammed him and told him off. And Stuart said, well, what's the point? Where would that have got us? It'd just make everything worse. No, it's better for me to accept responsibility and say, yep, I'll help you. And that Stuart's assistant was so struck by that, he went along to a Alpha course that Stuart was running in his home. He was deeply impacted. In the middle of this, in verse 18, Paul says, live peaceably with all. Now that's a big ask, isn't it? Especially to the person who's constantly picking fights with you, whose aim in life seems to be make your life miserable. But Paul is realistic. Sometimes peace isn't possible. It takes two to tango, as they say. But what Paul's saying here is the fight ought not to continue because you keep it going. You ought to do whatever is possible, as far as it depends on you, to make peace. It may be that the other person doesn't want that or they're not ready for it. And we can understand that, can't we? Because how long did it take us to make peace with God? And how long does it take us to make peace with people around us? So Paul is saying, do whatever you can, but it may be that it's not possible in the end or at that time. We want people to see and understand and hear and respond to the grace of God. That's what we want for everyone, isn't it? So Paul says, call off the fight. So that's dealing with people who oppose us. Secondly, harmony in the body, dealing with fellow Christians who we're out of harmony with. There's an old little poem that says, to live above with the saints we love, that will be grace and glory. To live below with the saints we know, that's a different story. That's true, isn't it? Live in harmony with one another, he says. Literally, it means think the same thoughts as one another. Now, does this mean we have to have the same opinions on everything? No, I don't think so. A commentator on this, Colin Cruiser, said the sense of these instructions is not that believers should hold exactly the same opinions, but they should think and act in ways that promote harmony and agreement. We are going to have different opinions, but it doesn't mean we have to have World War III over it. Well, how do we do that? How do we live in harmony with one another? Paul gives two really sensible bits of advice here. The first is about our demeanour or our orientation. Put others first. Very often when we're out of harmony, we think, well, I'm hurt, and I'm the one who's been wronged here. And Paul says, no, don't be self-centred, be other-centred. If they're rejoicing, rejoice with them. If they're weeping, weep with them. To do this, actually, we need to enter into their lives, don't we? Enter into what's going on in their lives so that we can empathise with them. Once our neighbour came over and absolutely blasted me because our dog was barking. and waking him up in the night. So he was really, really angry, and he used some choice words. Anyway, I apologised profusely, and I said, look, we'll do something to stop it. And anyway, later on, I went over to talk to him and apologise again and just to let him know what we were going to do about it. Anyway, we got talking. And it turned out that he wasn't sleeping very well at all. And partly because of our dog, but the major reason was that he just found out that his daughter had a life-threatening illness, a 20-year-old girl. And anyway, by the grace of God, I was able to weep with those who weep and enter into the pain that he was experiencing. And it was great just to talk with him. Now, if I'd told him to nick off and all that stuff, I wouldn't have had that opportunity, would I? You empathise with other people. Enter into what's going on in their lives. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. There's a distinct lack of empathy out there, isn't there? I read a story of a bloke who put an ad in the paper, and he said, I will listen to you uninterrupted for $30 an hour. You can talk as much as you like and I'll listen to you. You pay me $30 an hour. And he was swamped with customers. People actually want to be listened to. We want to be listened to. And there's a reason why we're upset. We actually want to talk with someone about it, don't we? Or if there's a reason why we're really rejoicing and really happy, we want to share it with somebody. But we've got to be honest here, don't we? Our nature is to do the opposite, isn't it? If those we don't get on with are rejoicing, we're weeping about it. How come they're rejoicing when they've been so miserable to me? Or it's the other way around, isn't it? When they're weeping, we rejoice. Oh, good, finally the Lord's got them. And we rejoice about it. Paul says do the opposite to what we feel like doing in here. One of my lecturers at uni once told me about how he'd been promoted above a Christian friend of mine. We were talking about him behind his back in a good Christian kind of way. And my lecturer shared with me how he felt really bad about it, to being promoted over this fella, Phil. And he told me, he said, I went to talk to Phil about it. And he said, you know what he said to me? He said, no. You're the right person for that position. I'm so glad that you got it. Your skills are much better than mine. And he genuinely said he's a really, really humble guy. And he was able actually to rejoice with Peter in his career success, genuinely. Now, how do you do it? Well, Paul's next bit of advice goes with it. He says, live humbly in verse 16. Don't be haughty, don't be high-minded or wise in your own sight. Now, this makes a huge lot of sense, doesn't it? If I think I'm better than you, how's that going to help our harmony? It's going to ruin it, isn't it? So Paul quite sensibly says, don't be haughty, don't be up yourself, don't be wise in your own sight. Conversely, associate with the lowly. Actually be proactive in practicing humility. Now this again runs counter to our culture, doesn't it? There's a kind of mentality that if you want to be successful, you've got to hang around with successful people. If you want to soar with the eagles, don't waddle around with the turkeys. If you want to be successful, hang around with successful people. They might be able to help you how to get on, actually. That's what we think about, isn't it? But the person whose mind is being transformed and being renewed by Christ thinks like Jesus. What did Jesus do? He hung around with the lowly. He himself was lowly, he said. He's lowly and humble of heart. And he lived it, didn't he? The very fact that he left the glory of heaven and came to earth and associated with people like us says actually that was his intention, to hang around with the lowly. He became a human, a servant, a slave. And his death, of course, shows the same thing, doesn't it? That he's associating with the lowly, those who need God's help. Andrew Murray says, humility is the displacement of self by the enthronement of God. Displacing yourself off the throne and enthroning God there. So getting rid of our pride and associating with the lowly moves us in a Christ-like direction, makes us more like Jesus. The last verse, verse 21, summarises all that Paul's been saying. And basically there are two ways to live, he says. You can either be overcome by evil, or you can overcome evil with good. There are two options here, aren't there? The first one actually is expressed in what we call a passive. So it means that you will be overcome by evil. You don't have to do anything, actually. That's our default thing, that we'll be overcome by evil if we don't take some action. There's no middle ground here. Way back in Genesis 4, when Cain was really jealous of his brother Abel, what did God say to him? He said, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. That's a similar thing to what Paul is saying here. If we do nothing, we'll be overcome by evil, our own evil thoughts and intentions, the evil around us, the work of Satan himself. But we must overcome evil with good. We need to be proactive. Let me encourage you today, particularly in this area of people who you don't get on with, let me encourage you to do an inventory of those people, not so you can work out how to take them down, but so you can think through, work out how you can do good to them, to find a way to bless them, find a way to do good to them. I'm going to suggest 3 steps here. Firstly, the first step is to give up your right for revenge. It's not yours anyway. It belongs to God, and you can trust him. That's what Joseph does, actually, in the story. As his brothers are there grovelling before him on the ground, and Joseph has the weapon of mass destruction. He just has to press the button. What he does is he puts the button outside the room. He tells his guards to go. He puts revenge out of his reach, actually. And he embraces his gobsmacked brothers. And he tells them, well, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He's trusting God to sort out whatever needs to be sorted out, if anything. And he sees the good in what God has done, even though this meant years and years of really hard stuff for him. Friends, of all people, us Christians, people who believe that God is in charge of everything, who believe that God is fair and just and he will sort out everything, of all people, we can let go of revenge, can't we? We don't have to do it. We don't have to harbour ill feeling towards others. So let me encourage you this morning, if you're involved in World War III with anybody, stop it, call it off. Lay down your arms. Put the weapon of mass destruction away. Get off Facebook or whatever you've got to do to let go of your right for revenge, because it's not yours. It's a phantom right. Somebody has said that whenever we fail to forgive someone, we take a captive. And that captive is ourselves. And we hold the key to our own cell. Step 2, work out how we can overcome evil with good with this person. How can I bless them? Jesus said to pray for them. Pray for those who despitefully use you. I put it to you, it's very, very hard to hate somebody that you're praying for. Pray for them. Those who speak against you, those who do ill towards you. Bless them. Speak well of them. Confer some benefit on them. Things that are good. That's what Joseph does. He embraces his brothers and he tells them, don't be afraid. He enters into what's going on in their minds and hearts, doesn't he? He knows they're scared stiff. Here we are. This guy can wipe us out in a second. And he embraces them. He says, don't worry. Don't be afraid. Step 3, do things that benefit the other person. Find out a need that they have and fill it as best you can. Again, that's what Joseph does. He provides food for his brothers. He provides land, a place for them to stay, so that they can live out the rest of their lives there in comfort. Friends, that's what Jesus did, isn't it? Jesus lived like this, didn't he? He could rightly have condemned us all to eternal punishment, given us what we deserved. But because he knew that we deserved that, and that our greatest need was forgiveness, what did he do? He humbled himself. He wasn't haughty. He associated with the lowly. He ends up on a cross between two robbers, two criminals. Why? So he can do the best benefit possible for you and for me. Give us what we don't deserve, eternal life. Early this year, Billy Graham, the great evangelist, died at the age of 99. In 1972, when the Vietnam War was raging, a prominent Christian leader wrote a letter to Billy Graham, a very angry and a very bitter letter. And it attacked him for not condemning the Vietnam War, which was raging then. With all the vast influence that Billy Graham had with governors and President Nixon, he didn't condemn the war. And this Christian leader who was writing to Billy put down Billy Graham's lack of saying anything, his silence, down to base motives. He said that's what he put in his letter. And his lust for famous friends. He called Billy a prostitute of the administration, consumed with desire to boost your own ego, even if you don't realise it. What a letter, a scorcher. It's awful, isn't it? Base, prostitute, egotist. How could this man possibly know Billy Graham's motives? It's one thing to criticise his silence, another thing to say, this is why you're doing it. How does he know? Is he God? And what's impressive is Billy Graham's response. And I'll quote to you from the letter that he wrote back to him. I can easily understand the harshness and outrage of your letter. I accept your rebuke with all the humility I can muster. If I were in your place and from your vantage point, I might have written a stronger letter. The tone of your letter in no way diminishes my own personal admiration for you and my affection for you in the Lord. And he concluded his letter by saying, I'm deeply grateful that you made this a private exchange. I admire your courage and frankness in writing a harsh letter. Your criticism is not taken lightly by me. Don't be overcome by evil. Overcome evil with good. Bless those who persecute you. Friends, let's take time to respond to the Lord. I've got no idea who your enemies are. We all have them, let's be honest. The Christian brothers and sisters that you're playing no speaks with. Friends, let's come before the Lord and let's just own up to that stuff and say, Lord, please help me to do what you say, not to take revenge, to speak well of others, to bless them and to do good towards them. Let's have some space just to respond to the Lord, then I'll lead us in prayer and then we'll have time for questions.